The courtroom was a place where emotions ran high, and today was no exception. The air inside felt heavy, thick with tension that seemed to press down on everyone present. Rows of wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators who had gathered to witness the outcome of what many considered a landmark case. Reporters sat at the edges, their pens poised over notepads, while cameras clicked softly in the background. The room buzzed with murmurs, whispers of anticipation, fear, and hope, but all fell silent as Judge Harold Whitaker entered. Judge Whitaker was known throughout the legal community for his stern expression and unwavering authority. He carried himself with an air of confidence that commanded respect, and his sharp eyes missed nothing. Today, however, there was something different about him. His usual calm demeanor seemed slightly strained, his jaw clenched just a fraction tighter than usual. It wasn't obvious to most people, but those who knew him well might have noticed it. A subtle sign that he was feeling the pressure of this particular case. At the heart of the matter was Mrs. Clara Thompson, a single mother whose life had been turned upside down by circumstances beyond her control. She sat nervously at the plaintiff's table, clutching her purse tightly in both hands. Her dark hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail, and though she tried to appear composed, her red-rimmed eyes betrayed the sleepless nights she'd endured leading up to this day. Beside her sat her lawyer, Mr. Daniels, a kind-hearted man with years of experience but far fewer resources compared to the opposing side. Across the aisle, the defense team loomed large, 3 polished attorneys dressed in expensive suits, their faces unreadable masks of professionalism. They represented Victor Langston, the CEO of a powerful real estate development company, accused of illegally evicting Clara and dozens of other families from their homes. These families had lived in the same neighborhood for generations, raising children, building memories, and creating a sense of community. But when Langston's company bought out the property, everything changed. Promises of fair compensation were broken, relocation assistance was denied, and now these families found themselves homeless, struggling to make ends meet. Clara had become the face of the fight against Langston's corporation. Her story resonated with so many others because it was one of resilience and determination. Despite losing her home, despite facing countless obstacles, she refused to give up. She believed in justice, not just for herself but for every family affected by Langston's greed. And yet, as the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that winning this battle would be anything but easy. Victor Langston didn't attend the hearings personally, preferring instead to let his lawyers handle the dirty work. But his presence was felt nonetheless. Every argument they made, every piece of evidence they presented reinforced the idea that money could buy power, and power could silence the truth. Documents were disputed, witnesses were discredited, and even the judge's rulings seemed to favor the defense more often than not. It was as if the odds were stacked impossibly high against Clara and her supporters. As the final day of the trial approached, tensions reached a breaking point. Clara barely ate or slept, consumed by anxiety over what the verdict might mean for her future. Her son Ethan did his best to comfort her, though he too struggled to stay hopeful. At only 10 years old, Ethan understood enough to know how much was at stake. He saw the worry etched into his mother's face, heard the frustration in her voice whenever she talked about the case, and felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on their little family. Ethan wasn't like other kids his age. While most boys spent their afternoons playing video games or riding bikes, Ethan preferred to spend time reading books borrowed from the library or tinkering with gadgets he found around the house. He had a curious mind, always asking questions and searching for answers. When his father passed away unexpectedly 2 years earlier, Ethan took it upon himself to step up and help his mom however he could. Whether it was cooking dinner, helping with chores, or simply being there to listen, Ethan did his part to keep their fragile world from falling apart. On this particular morning, Ethan accompanied his mother to court, sitting quietly in the back row of the gallery. He watched intently as the proceedings unfolded, taking mental notes of every detail. Something about the way the defense lawyers spoke, with such certainty, such arrogance, made his blood boil. How could they sit there and lie so easily? Didn't they care about the lives they were destroying? Ethan clenched his fist tightly, trying to contain his anger. He wanted to scream, to shout out loud and tell everyone the truth. But he knew better. This was a courtroom after all, and judges didn't take kindly to interruptions. Still, as Judge Whitaker prepared to deliver his ruling, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that justice wasn't going to prevail. He glanced at his mother, who sat stiffly in her chair, her knuckles white from gripping the edge of the table. Then he looked at the judge, whose face remained impassive as ever. For a moment their eyes met, and Ethan felt a jolt of recognition. He didn't know why, but something about Judge Whitaker unsettled him. Maybe it was the way he avoided looking directly at Clara during key moments of testimony. Or maybe it was the slight twitch of his hand when certain documents were mentioned. Whatever it was, Ethan couldn't ignore it. And then, just as Judge Whitaker opened his mouth to speak, Ethan remembered the notebook. Hidden safely in his backpack, it contained letters written years ago. Letters that revealed secrets too dangerous to ignore. Secrets that could change everything. As the judge's words began to fill the room, Ethan realized he had a choice to make. Stay silent and let the system win, or speak up and risk everything for the chance to expose the truth. His heart raced as he weighed the options, knowing that whatever decision he made would have consequences far greater than he could imagine. Little did anyone know, the next few minutes would alter the course of not just this trial, but the lives of everyone involved, including Judge Whitaker himself. As Judge Whitaker began to speak, his deep voice resonated through the courtroom, each word carrying the weight of finality. The spectators leaned forward in their seats, hanging on every syllable. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, capturing what they believed would be the closing chapter of this high-stakes legal battle. Clara Thompson sat frozen, her eyes glued to the judge, her hands trembling slightly as she braced herself for the verdict that could either save her family or shatter their future entirely. Ethan, seated quietly in the back row, felt his heart pounding faster with each passing second. He clutched the straps of his backpack tightly, his knuckles turning white. His mind raced with thoughts of the notebook hidden inside it, the same notebook that contained letters written by his late father, letters that revealed a dark secret tying Judge Whitaker to Victor Langston's real estate empire. Ethan had read those letters countless times, memorizing every line, every damning detail. And now, as the judge prepared to deliver a ruling that seemed all but predetermined, Ethan knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. Before anyone could react, Ethan stood up abruptly. The sudden movement startled the entire room, drawing gasps and murmurs from the crowd. Security guards immediately turned their attention toward him, ready to intervene. But before they could take a step, Ethan shouted two words that echoed loudly through the tense silence. "Not fair!" The courtroom erupted into chaos. People whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief while others looked at the boy with curiosity. Clara whipped around in her seat, her eyes wide with shock. She mouthed his name, silently pleading with him to sit down, but Ethan ignored her. His focus was entirely on Judge Whitaker, who sat frozen behind the bench staring at the boy with an unreadable expression. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The judge's face betrayed no emotion, yet there was something unsettling about the way he hesitated. Normally, such an outburst would have been met with swift punishment, a contempt of court charge, perhaps even removal by security. But instead of calling for order, Judge Whitaker simply raised a hand, signaling the guards to hold their positions. The gesture was subtle but firm, and it silenced the room instantly. All eyes were now on Ethan, the small figure standing defiantly. "Near the exit, come here," Judge Whitaker said, his voice calm but laced with authority. There was no anger in his tone, only a strange curiosity that made the hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stand up. Slowly, Ethan stepped forward, his sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor. Every step felt like an eternity, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He could feel the stares of everyone in the room boring into him, some sympathetic, others skeptical, but he refused to look away from the judge. When Ethan reached the front of the courtroom, he stopped, just short of the witness stand. His heart was racing, but he forced himself to breathe deeply. Reaching into his backpack, he pulled out the worn notebook and held it up for everyone to see. The cover was faded, its edges frayed from years of use, but it carried within it the truth that Ethan had promised to protect. "What is that?" Judge Whitaker asked, his voice steady but tinged with unease. For the first time since the trial began, his composure seemed to falter. He shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting his glasses as if trying to get a better look at the object in Ethan's hands. "It's proof," Ethan replied, his voice clear and unwavering despite his nerves. He opened the notebook to a marked page and began reading aloud. The letters inside detailed a series of communications between Judge Whitaker and Victor Langston. They spoke of favors exchanged, promises made, and agreements sealed behind closed doors. According to the documents, Langston had funded Whitaker's campaign for a higher judicial position in exchange for favorable rulings in key cases, including this one. As Ethan read, the courtroom grew quieter and quieter until you could hear a pin drop. Spectators exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from disbelief to outrage. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes, their pens flying across the pages. Even the defense attorneys appeared stunned, their confident facades crumbling under the weight of the revelation. Judge Whitaker's face turned pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He stared at Ethan, unable to comprehend how such damning evidence had fallen into the hands of a child. His mind raced, searching for an explanation, a loophole, anything that could salvage the situation. But the more Ethan read, the clearer it became that there was no escaping the truth. The letters painted a vivid picture of corruption, betrayal, and greed, a stark contrast to the image of integrity Whitaker had worked so hard to maintain. Clara watched the scene unfold with tears streaming down her face. She didn't fully understand how her son had come into possession of these documents, but she knew one thing for certain. Ethan had risked everything to expose the injustice they had been fighting against. Her chest swelled with pride and fear, simultaneously unsure of what consequences might follow. Meanwhile, the opposing counsel tried to regain control of the situation. One of Langston's lawyers stood up, objecting vehemently to the admissibility of the evidence. "Your Honor, this is hearsay. It's irrelevant and completely unverified," he exclaimed, his voice rising with desperation. But Judge Whitaker didn't respond. He remained motionless, his gaze fixed on Ethan, as if seeing him for the first time. Ethan finished reading and closed the notebook, clutching it tightly to his chest. The silence that followed was deafening. No one dared to speak, unsure of what would happen next. Would the judge dismiss the evidence? Would he call for an investigation? Or would he try to sweep the whole thing under the rug? Finally, Judge Whitaker broke the silence. "Young man," he said, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "Where did you get this information?" Ethan took a deep breath before answering. "My dad worked for Mr. Langston's company. He found these letters before they fired him." His voice cracked slightly as he mentioned his father, but he quickly regained his composure. "After he died, I found the notebook. I promised myself I'd use it to help my mom and our neighbors. We deserve justice." The sincerity in Ethan's words struck a chord with everyone in the room. Even the most hardened skeptics couldn't deny the courage it took for a 10-year-old boy to stand up to one of the most powerful figures in the legal system. As the full weight of the situation sank in, the atmosphere shifted. What had started as a routine court hearing had transformed into something much bigger, a reckoning not just for Judge Whitaker but for the entire system he represented. And though no one knew it yet, this moment would mark the beginning of a chain reaction that would change lives forever. The courtroom was frozen in time, as if the entire world had stopped to witness what would happen next. Judge Whitaker's face, usually a mask of authority and control, now betrayed a vulnerability that no one had ever seen before. His eyes darted between Ethan and the notebook, his mind racing to process the gravity of the situation. The boy stood there, small but resolute, holding the worn notebook like a shield against injustice. Every word he had spoken hung heavy in the air, weaving a web of truth that threatened to unravel everything Judge Whitaker had built over decades. Ethan took another step forward, his sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished floor. He opened the notebook again, this time flipping through its pages to reveal more letters, dates, and even handwritten notes from his late father. "My dad wasn't just any employee," Ethan explained, his voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. "He worked in the accounting department at Langston's company. One day he found these letters hidden in some old files. At first he didn't know what they meant, but when he started asking questions, things got bad." The boy paused, swallowing hard. For a brief moment his composure wavered, and the pain of losing his father flickered across his young face. But he quickly composed himself, determined to finish what he had started. "They fired him without giving a reason," Ethan continued. "And then, not long after, he died in a car accident. Mom says it was just bad luck, but I think they did something to him. I don't know how or why, but I do know that my dad wouldn't have kept these letters unless they were important." Clara, sitting just a few feet away, covered her mouth with trembling hands. She hadn't known about the notebook until now, and the realization hit her like a tidal wave. Her late husband, Mark, had always been meticulous, keeping records of everything: receipts, work memos, even grocery lists. But she never imagined he'd stumbled upon something so dangerous, something that could cost him his life. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she looked at her son, pride mingling with grief. Judge Whitaker leaned back in his chair, his fingers pressed together in front of his lips. He seemed to be weighing his options, though the color draining from his face suggested he already knew there was no easy way out of this. The accusations weren't just hearsay, they were backed by concrete evidence, letters bearing his own signature, conversations detailing specific cases where he had ruled in Langston's favor. It was damning proof, and the longer Ethan held the notebook aloft, the harder it became for the judge to deny its authenticity. One of Langston's lawyers stood abruptly, slamming his hand on the table. "Your Honor, this is preposterous," he exclaimed, his voice rising in desperation. "These documents are unverified and irrelevant. They cannot be admitted as evidence without proper authentication. This is nothing more than a child's wild accusation." But Judge Whitaker didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to Ethan, studying him with an intensity that made the boy shift uncomfortably under his gaze. "How do we know these aren't forged?" the judge asked finally, his tone measured but tinged with unease. "Anyone could have written them. Anyone could have planted them." Ethan shook his head firmly. "My dad didn't forge anything," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "He was a good man. He wouldn't lie about something like this, and besides," he hesitated for a moment, then reached into his backpack again and pulled out a USB drive. "I also have digital copies of all these letters. Screenshots, emails, everything. If you want, I can show you." The mention of digital evidence sent another ripple of shock through the courtroom. In today's world, electronic records carried undeniable weight, especially when they could be traced and verified. The opposing counsel exchanged panicked glances, their confidence crumbling under the weight of Ethan's revelations. Even Judge Whitaker seemed to deflate slightly, his shoulders sagging as if burdened by the enormity of the truth staring him in the face. At that moment, Clara rose from her seat, unable to contain herself any longer. "Your Honor," she began, her voice shaking but resolute, "I may not understand all the legal details, but I know one thing for sure. My family, and many others, have suffered because of greed and corruption. My husband gave his life trying to expose it, and now my son is risking everything to make sure justice is served. Please, please don't let us down." Her plea hung in the air, raw and heartfelt. The room fell silent once again, the tension palpable. Everyone present seemed to hold their breath, waiting for Judge Whitaker's response. Would he admit to his involvement? Would he try to deflect blame? Or would he double down and risk destroying not only his career but also the lives of countless innocent people? Finally, Judge Whitaker spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "Young man," he said, addressing Ethan directly, "you've presented troubling information. Information that requires further investigation. I cannot render a verdict today, not until we get to the bottom of this. He glanced briefly at the defense team, who looked visibly shaken, before continuing. I am ordering a recess. Court will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the session, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters rushed toward the exits, eager to file their stories. Spectators whispered among themselves, debating the implications of what had just transpired. Meanwhile, Clara pulled Ethan into a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face as she whispered words of gratitude and love. For Ethan, however, the battle was far from over. As he clutched the notebook tightly in his hands, he knew that exposing the truth was only the first step. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. But for now, he allowed himself a small smile. Justice might still feel distant, but for the first time in a long while, it felt possible. The night following the dramatic courtroom scene was one of restless anticipation. News outlets buzzed with headlines about the shocking interruption and the allegations made by a 10-year-old boy against one of the city's most respected judges. Social media platforms lit up with debates, opinions, and speculations as people from all walks of life weighed in on the unfolding drama. Some praised Ethan's bravery, calling him a hero for standing up to corruption. Others dismissed his claims as the desperate act of a child trying to protect his family. Amid the chaos, Clara and Ethan found themselves at the center of a storm they could neither control nor fully comprehend. Clara spent the evening pacing their small apartment, her mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. She had always believed in justice, but now she felt like she was walking a tightrope between hope and despair. The weight of everything, the eviction, the trial, the loss of her husband, and now this, pressed heavily on her shoulders. Yet despite the overwhelming uncertainty, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride for her son. Ethan had shown courage beyond his years, risking everything to fight for what was right. It was a side of him she hadn't seen before, a strength that reminded her so much of his father. Ethan, meanwhile, sat cross-legged on the floor of their living room, staring at the notebook in his hands. He had read its contents so many times that he knew every word by heart, but tonight it felt different. Tonight the letters weren't just pieces of paper, they were weapons and shields that had exposed the truth to the world. As he flipped through the pages, he thought about his dad, wondering if he'd be proud of what he had done. Would he have wanted Ethan to take such a bold step? Or would he have told him to stay quiet and let the adults handle it? Before bed, Clara knelt beside Ethan and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You did something amazing today," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I need you to promise me one thing. No matter what happens tomorrow, we face it together, okay?" Ethan nodded, though his expression betrayed a mix of determination and fear. "I'm not scared, Mom," he replied, though his quivering voice suggested otherwise. "We're doing the right thing. That's all that matters." The next morning, the courtroom was packed even before the proceedings began. Reporters jostled for space near the front, cameras clicking incessantly as spectators filed in. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a mix of excitement and apprehension. When Judge Whitaker entered, his usual commanding presence seemed diminished. His steps were slower, his posture less rigid, as if the burden of the previous day's revelations had sapped his energy. For the first time, he looked not like a judge, but like a man cornered, searching for a way out. As the session began, Judge Whitaker addressed the court, his voice steady but devoid of its usual authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday's events have raised serious questions that must be addressed. In light of the evidence presented by the young witness, I have decided to recuse myself from presiding over this case." Gasps rippled through the room, followed by murmurs of disbelief. Recusal was rare, especially in cases involving high-profile defendants, and it signaled that Whitaker himself recognized the conflict of interest, or worse, the validity of Ethan's claims. A replacement judge was quickly appointed, a seasoned jurist named Judge Evelyn Carter, known for her impartiality and sharp legal mind. After a brief introduction, Judge Carter wasted no time diving into the heart of the matter. This court will now hear arguments regarding the admissibility of the evidence provided by the plaintiff, she announced, her tone firm and authoritative. Counsel for both parties may proceed. Langston's defense team launched an aggressive counterattack, arguing that the letters and digital records were inadmissible due to lack of proper authentication. They claimed the documents could have been altered or fabricated, pointing out that Ethan, as a minor, lacked credibility as a witness. One of the attorneys even suggested that Clara might have coached her son to make the accusations in order to sway public opinion. But Mr. Daniels, Clara's lawyer, countered with equal fervor. "Your Honor," he began, addressing Judge Carter, "the authenticity of these documents can be verified through independent analysis. Furthermore, the fact that they were discovered by the late Mr. Mark Thompson, an employee of the defendant's company, adds significant weight to their credibility. To dismiss them outright without investigation would be a grave miscarriage of justice." Judge Carter listened intently, her expression unreadable. After several minutes of heated debate, she ruled that the evidence would indeed be admitted, pending verification by a neutral third party. The decision sent shockwaves through the courtroom, particularly among Langston's lawyers, who exchanged anxious glances. For Clara and Ethan, however, it was a small but crucial victory, a sign that the system might still work if given a chance. As the day wore on, additional witnesses were called to testify. Former employees of Langston's company came forward, corroborating parts of Ethan's story. They spoke of unethical practices, illegal evictions, and intimidation tactics used to silence anyone who dared question the company's actions. Each testimony added another layer to the mounting case against Victor Langston, painting a picture of systemic greed and exploitation. One particularly damning account came from a former accountant named Sarah Bennett. She recounted how she had uncovered discrepancies in financial reports linked to properties acquired under questionable circumstances. When she reported her findings to upper management, she was promptly fired and threatened with legal action if she spoke publicly about what she had seen. Her testimony resonated deeply with the jury, reinforcing the idea that Langston's empire was built on lies and manipulation. Throughout it all, Ethan remained seated quietly in the back row, his eyes fixed on the proceedings. Occasionally, Clara reached back to squeeze his hand, offering silent reassurance. Despite the growing support for their cause, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. Langston's lawyers were relentless, throwing up roadblock after roadblock in an effort to discredit the evidence and undermine the witnesses. At times, it felt like they were fighting not just against individuals, but against an entire system designed to protect the powerful. By the end of the day, exhaustion hung heavy in the air. Judge Carter adjourned the court until the following morning, leaving everyone to grapple with the implications of what had transpired. Outside, reporters swarmed around Clara and Ethan, peppering them with questions about their feelings and hopes for the outcome. Clara politely declined to comment, shielding her son from the intrusive cameras and microphones. That night, as they walked home under the dim glow of streetlights, Ethan turned to his mother and asked, "Do you think we'll win, Mom?" Clara hesitated, unsure of how to answer. Winning wasn't guaranteed, and the road ahead promised to be fraught with challenges. But looking into her son's determined eyes, she realized something important. They had already won in a way. By exposing the truth, they had forced the world to pay attention, to see the faces behind the statistics, the lives shattered by greed. And that, she knew, was a victory worth holding on to. "We've already made a difference, Ethan," she said finally, smiling through her tears. "No matter what happens next, we've shown people that it's possible to stand up, even when it feels impossible." The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed to capacity. The air buzzed with anticipation as people from all walks of life gathered to witness what many believed would be a pivotal moment in the fight against corruption. Reporters lined the walls, their cameras ready to capture every detail. Spectators whispered among themselves, speculating about how the case might conclude. For Clara Thompson and her son Ethan, this was more than just another court hearing. It was the culmination of months of struggle, sacrifice, and courage. Judge Evelyn Carter entered the room with an air of authority that immediately silenced the murmurs. She took her seat behind the bench, her expression calm but resolute. After reviewing the evidence presented over the past few days, she announced that it was time for closing arguments. The defense and prosecution teams had one last chance to sway the jury and the public before the verdict would be delivered. Langston's lawyers launched into a passionate defense, attempting to cast doubt on the authenticity of the documents and the credibility of the witnesses. They argued that the accusations were based on circumstantial evidence and emotional appeals rather than concrete proof. "Your Honor," one of the attorneys said, addressing Judge Carter, "we must consider the possibility that these allegations are motivated by personal vendettas or misinformation. To convict our client solely on such shaky ground would set a dangerous precedent." But Mr. Daniels, Clara's lawyer, countered with equal fervor. He reminded the court of the overwhelming body of evidence. The letters detailing corrupt agreements between Judge Whitaker and Victor Langston, the testimonies of former employees who had risked everything to speak out, and the digital records, verified by independent experts. "This isn't just about one family or one neighborhood," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "It's about holding powerful individuals accountable when they abuse their positions for personal gain. If we fail to do so today, we send a message that justice is only for those who can afford it." As the arguments unfolded, Ethan sat quietly in the back row, clutching the worn notebook tightly in his hands. His heart raced as he listened to each side present its case, knowing that the outcome would not only affect his family, but also countless others who had suffered at the hands of Langston's company. Despite the weight of the moment, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had done everything he could to expose the truth. Now, it was up to the system to decide whether justice would prevail. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the four persons stood and read the decision aloud. "We find the defendant, Victor Langston, and his real estate development company guilty of illegal evictions, fraudulent practices, and unethical conduct." The words echoed through the room like a thunderclap, sending waves of shock and relief rippling through the crowd. Clara burst into tears, covering her face with her hands as the reality of the verdict sank in. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that her family might finally have a chance at rebuilding their lives. Ethan, sitting beside her, let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. A small smile spread across his face as he looked around the room, taking in the expressions of triumph and vindication on the faces of those who had fought alongside them. Victor Langston, though absent from the proceedings, issued a statement through his lawyers vowing to appeal the decision. But even he couldn't deny the damage done to his reputation. News outlets pounced on the story, exposing decades of questionable business practices and unethical behavior. Investors began pulling out of his projects, and regulatory agencies launched investigations into other aspects of his operations. It seemed that the empire he had built on greed and exploitation was beginning to crumble. Meanwhile, Judge Harold Whitaker faced consequences of his own. Following his recusal from the case, an internal investigation revealed the extent of his involvement in the corrupt dealings with Langston. Evidence showed that he had accepted campaign contributions and favors in exchange for favorable rulings in multiple cases. Facing mounting pressure, Whitaker resigned from his position and issued a public apology, acknowledging his role in perpetuating injustice. While some viewed his resignation as an act of cowardice, others saw it as a step toward accountability, a reminder that no one, not even a judge, is above the law. In the weeks that followed, Clara and Ethan became symbols of hope and resilience. Their story inspired others to speak out against corruption and demand transparency from those in power. Local organizations rallied around them, offering support and resources to help them get back on their feet. Clara found work as a community advocate, using her experience to assist other families facing similar struggles. Ethan, too, became a local hero, celebrated for his bravery and determination. Schools invited him to speak at assemblies, where he encouraged students to stand up for what they believed in, even when it felt impossible. For Clara, the victory was bittersweet. She wished her late husband Mark could have been there to see it, to share in the triumph and vindication. Yet she knew he was with them in spirit, guiding them through the darkest moments and cheering them on when they needed it most. One evening, as she tucked Ethan into bed, she kissed his forehead and whispered, "Your dad would be so proud of you, sweetheart. We did it together, you and me." Ethan smiled sleepily, hugging the notebook close to his chest. "I think Dad helped us win," he murmured before drifting off to sleep. Though the battle was won, the war against systemic injustice continued. The case sparked widespread discussions about ethics in both the legal and corporate worlds, prompting calls for reform and greater oversight. Lawmakers introduced new legislation aimed at preventing similar abuses of power in the future. Communities came together to support one another, refusing to let fear or intimidation silence their voices. For Ethan and Clara, life slowly began to return to normal, or at least a new version of it. They moved into a modest apartment provided by a non-profit organization dedicated to helping displaced families. Clara enrolled in night classes to further her education, while Ethan threw himself into schoolwork and extracurricular activities. Despite the challenges they still faced, they carried with them a renewed sense of purpose and hope. And so, the boy who had once shouted 2 words in a crowded courtroom, "Not fair," became a catalyst for change. His actions proved that even the smallest voices could make the loudest impact, inspiring others to believe in the power of truth and justice. As the sun set on their city, casting golden light over streets once shadowed by despair, Clara and Ethan walked hand in hand, ready to embrace whatever the future held.